Welcome to episode 40 of Pulse of Physiology. I'm your host, Dr. Jim Davis, and today we're diving deep into one of the most comprehensive and informative diagrams in cardiovascular physiology, the Wiggers diagram. This diagram brings together multiple physiological variables, including ventricular volume, ventricular pressure, electrical activity, or the ECG, and heart sounds. This provides a full picture of the cardiac cycle. And so by the end of this episode, you'll have a clear understanding of how these variables interact and influence each other during a heartbeat. So let's get started. The cardiac cycle represents the events that occur from the start of one heartbeat to the next. This consists of alternating systolic or contraction and diastolic or relaxation phases. This cycle is divided into four key phases: ventricular filling, isovolumic contraction, ventricular ejection, and isovolumic relaxation. Each phase is dictated by changes in pressure, which determine when heart valves open and close, and this affects ventricular volume and blood movement. Now, at the beginning of the cycle during ventricular filling, the heart is in diastole, meaning the ventricles are relaxed and blood is passively flowing from the atria into the ventricles. This occurs because atrial pressure is higher than ventricular pressure, and this keeps the AV or atrioventricular valves open, and those valves are the tricuspid and the mitral valve. And the mitral valve is sometimes known as the bicuspid valve. Now, as blood continues to fill the ventricles, ventricular pressure gradually rises. Toward the end of filling, the P wave appears on the ECG, which signals atrial depolarization. This electrical event triggers atrial contraction or atrial systole, which forces the remaining blood into the ventricles, which further increases ventricular volume to its maximum. And this is known as end diastolic volume, or EDV. Immediately following atrial contraction, the ventricles begin to depolarize, which is represented by the QRS complex on the ECG. This marks the beginning of isovolumic contraction. As ventricular muscle fibers contract, ventricular pressure rises sharply, surpassing atrial pressure, causing the AV valves to snap shut. This closure produces the first heart sound, S1 or lub. However, at this stage, ventricular pressure is still lower than aortic pressure, so the semilunar valves, both aortic and pulmonary, remain closed. Since all valves are shut, the volume within the ventricles remains constant, while pressure continues to rise rapidly. This buildup of pressure prepares the heart for the next phase. So to clarify, isovolumic contraction actually begins when the AV valves close. That's the mark of this phase, or the marking of the beginning of this phase. Now, once ventricular pressure surpasses aortic pressure, the semilunar valves open, which starts ventricular ejection. Blood is forcefully expelled into the aorta and pulmonary arteries, causing a rapid drop in ventricular volume. During this phase, aortic pressure rises sharply as blood enters the aorta, ensuring systemic circulation. Ventricular contraction continues, maintaining high pressure to push blood forward. As contraction weakens, blood ejection slows, and aortic pressure begins to decline slightly. Throughout this phase, blood is delivered to tissues, maintaining systemic circulation. As the ventricles complete contraction and enter repolarization, the T wave appears on the ECG. Ventricular pressure drops rapidly, falling below aortic pressure, which causes the semilunar valves to close, which produces the second heart sound, S2 or dub. The closure of the aortic valve marks the beginning of isovolumic relaxation. The closure of this valve also causes a small pressure spike in the aortic pressure curve, which is known as the dicrotic notch, and this occurs due to the brief backflow of blood against the aortic valve before it fully seals shut. However, at this stage, ventricular pressure is still much greater than atrial pressure, meaning the AV valves remain closed. With all valves shut, ventricular volume remains constant, and the heart prepares for the next cycle. And this will continue until ventricular pressure drops below atrial pressure. When that happens, the AV valves open, which is the transition from isovolumic relaxation to filling. And then we start all over. Now, understanding the Wiggers diagram means recognizing how these mechanical, electrical, and auditory events are interconnected. The QRS complex signals ventricular contraction, which increases pressure, which leads to the AV valve closure and isovolumic contraction. The moment ventricular pressure surpasses aortic pressure, the semilunar valves open, which allows ejection and volume in the ventricle to decrease. Finally, as repolarization occurs, ventricular relaxation begins, causing semilunar valve closure and isovolumic relaxation. To summarize, ventricular filling occurs when atrial pressure is higher than ventricular pressure, leading to AV valve opening and passive blood flow. Isovolumic contraction begins as the QRS complex appears, which marks ventricular depolarization and isovolumic contraction. This contraction rapidly increases ventricular pressure, which occurs when the AV valves are closed and the semilunar valves remain shut. Ventricular ejection follows once ventricular pressure exceeds aortic pressure, which causes the semilunar valves to open and blood to be expelled. As the ventricles relax following the T wave, semilunar valves close, which initiates isovolumic relaxation, where the ventricles reset for the next heartbeat. And so that's it for episode 40 of the Pulse of Physiology. I hope this episode has helped you see how ventricular volume, pressure changes, ECG activity, and heart sounds are all intricately related and shown within the Wiggers diagram. Join me next time for episode 41, where we'll take a deeper dive into the cardiac cycle and explain how these events play out in real time. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and stay curious.